Ancient Egypt was one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world, renowned today for its rich culture and enduring legacy. When we think of Egypt, its grand architecture and powerful rulers often come to mind. However, in this episode, we will explore a different yet equally fascinating subject: the diet of the ancient Egyptians. From everyday meals to lavish feasts, we will gain insight into the eating habits of both the common people and the wealthy elite. It should be noted that no surviving cookbooks from ancient Egypt have been discovered. However, there are many diverse sources from which we can infer and piece together a picture of their culinary traditions. One of the richest sources on ancient Egyptian cuisine comes from the artwork on the tombs of kings, high-ranking officials, and priests. The elaborate wall paintings and reliefs found in these burial sites frequently depict scenes of feasts, food offerings, and agricultural practices. Another valuable source is medical recipes found on papyri. While not culinary recipes, these texts reveal many of the ingredients available at the time and how they were processed, including methods such as boiling, baking, and fermenting. Archaeological evidence also provides essential insights. Excavations have revealed preserved food offerings in tombs meant to sustain the deceased in the afterlife. Additionally, organic remains of food and beverages, along with kitchen tools, storage vessels, and hearths, have been discovered in various settlements. Finally, written records from the Greco-Roman period, though somewhat removed from the peak of ancient Egyptian civilization, still provide important details about the region's food culture. Most cooking was done outdoors or in semi-covered courtyards, with more well-off households sometimes having dedicated kitchen spaces. Open fires and simple clay stoves served as the primary means of cooking. Wealthy Egyptians would typically eat 3 times a day, with the heaviest meal at midday. Ancient Egypt's agriculture was centered around 2 staple grains: barley and emmer wheat, widely cultivated along the Nile and essential to both sustenance and trade. Bread was the cornerstone of the Egyptian diet, consumed daily by people of all social classes. Most breads were made from barley flour, while wheat breads were typically reserved for the elite. The dough-making process involved mixing flour with water and salt, often in large containers. Unleavened loaves were commonly made, but the use of leavening is also well documented, with evidence suggesting that Egyptians utilized sourdough starters, remnants of old dough left to ferment overnight and added into fresh batches. By at least 1500 BC, the Egyptians had also developed a refined yeast strain to enhance fermentation. Along with water and salt, many other ingredients were used, particularly in breads made for special occasions. These included varieties made with honey, dates, figs, nuts, seeds, milk, and various herbs. Baking techniques varied widely. Some loaves were cooked directly in open embers, while others were placed on the inner walls of clay ovens or in pottery molds. In some methods, a pot containing the bread was placed inside the oven and covered with a lid to create a steaming effect, resulting in softer loaves. The Egyptians made breads in various different shapes and forms, such as ovals, triangles, and even designs resembling animals or human figures, often for religious festivals. In addition to bread, they also made pastries and cakes on special occasions. A common food in ancient Egypt, particularly among the wealthier classes, was legumes. These included chickpeas, lentils, lupins, black-eyed peas, and broad fava beans, as well as pigeon peas, asparagus peas, and grass peas. Legumes were typically included in dishes like soups and were sometimes ground into flour to be added to bread dough. Bread paired with vegetables was the typical daily meal for most Egyptians. A worker's lunch often consisted of bread, onions, and beer. Onions and garlic were among the most common vegetables, both of which were smaller than their modern counterparts. Other popular vegetables included lettuce, which was associated with fertility and often used in religious offerings, radishes, cucumbers, leeks, and okra. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, the Egyptians also ate parts of wild plants, such as the roots of papyrus and the seeds of water lilies. In ancient Egypt, meat was considered a luxury and its consumption varied according to social class. The most common livestock was cattle, goats, sheep, and pigs. Beef was rarely eaten, primarily because oxen were essential for agricultural work and because meat from large animals was difficult to preserve in the Egyptian heat. Evidence of beef consumption comes mostly from elaborate tombs and temple offerings. Goats and sheep were occasionally eaten by the wealthy and middle class. Archaeological evidence suggests that common people sometimes used the fat rendered from the sheep's tail for cooking. Dairy products like milk and cheese are rarely mentioned in ancient writings or depicted in reliefs. However, archaeological research has discovered residues of cow's milk in tombs and sheep and goat milk in thousands of village sites. It is likely that common people made a form of clarified butter, which is butter melted to remove its milk solids and water. As for pork, writings suggest that during the New Kingdom period and later, it was only eaten on the day celebrating the victory of the god Horus over the god Seth. However, archaeological evidence indicates that in earlier times, particularly during the Middle Kingdom, pork was frequently consumed by common people. The Egyptians also raised birds as livestock, with ducks and geese being especially common and valued mainly for their eggs, which were a staple of the Egyptian diet. Roast goose was a popular dish, typically eaten during religious festivals, while roast ducks were left as offerings in the tombs of the Egyptian elite. Evidence suggests that pelicans were occasionally kept for their eggs, though this seems to have been very rare. Furthermore, pigeons were raised in dovecotes primarily for their meat. Hunting provided an additional source of meat for both the nobility and the lower classes. Nobles often participated in hunting expeditions as a display of status, targeting various animals such as antelope, gazelle, wild sheep, hedgehogs, and desert hares using spears, bows and arrows, or lassos. The most prestigious game was wild cattle, which were hunted by the king himself. The majority of hunting, though, was focused on the Nile's wild birds, including ducks, red-breasted geese, storks, finches, egrets, avocates, herons, cranes, and quail. These were hunted using bows, spears, traps, or nets. Birds and, on rare occasions, land animals were sometimes captured alive, kept in pens, and force-fed to enhance their flavor and produce fattier meat. Duck and goose grease were used as cooking ingredients in most households. Grilling appears to have been the preferred method for cooking meat. Another method was simmering cuts of meat in pots with various additional ingredients. Stewing and brewing were also practiced, but less frequently. Although dishes in ancient Egypt were often served with side meals, meat was typically accompanied only by bread, probably because they valued its taste. The Egyptians relied heavily on food storage and used various preservation methods to extend the shelf life of the supplies. Archaeological evidence reveals techniques such as storing fat, raw and cooked meat in jars with a strong brine solution. Another common method involved seasoning thin strips of meat with salt and spices before hanging them to dry. Fish from the Nile was a major source of protein for the average Egyptian. Fishermen used various methods to catch them, including scoop, trawl, and seine nets, as well as weighted basket traps. Occasionally, they would also use simpler tools like multi-hooked lines. Over 20 different types of fish were consumed, including carp, grey mullet, perch, oxyrhynchus, synodontis, lepidotis, tilapia, and catfish. a popular delicacy was the salted and dried eggs of the grey mullet. Nuts were a rare commodity in ancient Egypt, with the tiger nut from the sedge plant being the only variety commonly consumed. Scientifically speaking, the tiger nut is a tuber, but it is often considered a nut due to its flavor and texture. Archaeological research suggests that some wealthy Egyptians occasionally ate almonds and walnuts, which were imported from Europe and the Near East. Salt was obtained from coastal pans and natural deposits in the Western Desert and Oasis. It was essential for curing and preserving fish and meat, as well as being an additive in bread and many other foods. The Egyptians used a variety of oils in their cooking, each derived from different plants and seeds. One of the most famous oils was extracted from the seeds of the desert date, the fruit of the Egyptian balsam tree. Another commonly used oil, known for its sweet flavor, came from the seeds of the Moringa peregrina plant. Other oils used in cooking included castor and linseed oil. It is also believed that sesame seed and flaxseed oil were used, as both sesame and especially flax were widely cultivated in Egypt. Flax was primarily grown for its fibers, which were used to make linen. Although olive trees were cultivated on a few elite estates on the Nile Delta, there is no evidence that olive oil was ever produced in Egypt, even during the Greek and Roman rule. The Egyptians used a wide variety of herbs and spices. Cumin, parsley, and coriander were among the most commonly used, while others included fenugreek, dill, sesame, mint, chervil, oregano, black seed mustard, and possibly cinnamon. In ancient Egypt, fruits were consumed by both the wealthy and common people. Figs were particularly popular, especially among the upper classes. The sycamore fig was one of the most abundant and widely eaten fruits. It was a symbol of Hathor, the Egyptian goddess of love, motherhood, beauty, and music. Dates from the date palm were another staple, eaten fresh or dried. Both dates and figs were sometimes mashed and added to sauces or bread. Carob trees were widespread, and their pods were commonly eaten on their own or used as a sweetener. Evidence suggests that apple trees were cultivated in the Nile Delta, though most apples were imported from other regions. Grapes, which required intensive care, were mainly grown by the elite. They were eaten fresh or dried, but most were used for winemaking. Pomegranates, introduced during the Second Intermediate Period, eventually became very popular. Other notable fruits included calabashes, melons, watermelons, persea, a fruit similar to avocado, and the dom palm, whose fruit was used to make cakes. The most famous and widely used sweetener in ancient Egypt was honey, consumed either on its own or as an additive, with apiculture flourishing the most in Lower Egypt. The bee was so revered by the Egyptians that it became a symbol of royal power. Although sugar production is now closely associated with modern Egypt, sugar was unknown to the ancient Egyptians, as sugar canes were not introduced to the region until the 7th century AD.